Good evening and welcome to Imperial Lates Online, our virtual exploration of science at Imperial College London. My name is Hayley Dunning and I am a science writer here at Imperial, covering everything natural sciences. So this latest and final Lates Online week before the series takes a break over the summer is celebrating the wonders of the animal kingdom, with scientists and conservationists working to understand and protect wildlife in the UK and around the world. Tonight, we are exploring the increasingly popular concept of rewilding. From reintroducing beavers to reclaiming hedgerows and planting urban wildflowers, we will explore how we can harness the power of the natural self-sustaining environment for the good of ourselves and the environment. We will also look at limitations and critiques of some interpretations of rewilding in the face of the dual-made issues of biodiversity loss and climate change. Now, we have a great expert panel joining us to unpack all this, but before I introduce them, I would like to remind everyone watching at home that this is an interactive event, so please do send us your questions and thoughts in the YouTube chat. Members of the Imperial team are working away in the background, monitoring the chat, and will be passing your questions and comments for me to read out or put to our guests. Can I please just ask that everyone out there be considerate of each other when you're posting? We want to create a welcoming space for this online conversation, and we'll be removing anything that disrupts the experience for others. So, if all that is understood, let's meet our speakers. First up, we have Tilly Collins, who is a Senior Fellow in Imperial's Centre for Environmental Policy, whose research incorporates elements of urban ecology, entomology, which is insects to you and me, and sustainability. Welcome, Tilly.
Good evening.
Next up, we have Henrika Schulte-Tubuna, or Henny, who is a final year PhD student at the Institute of Zoology at ZSL and Imperial College London. She's interested in the potential of rewilding as a conservation tool and recently led a review on the diversity of values among rewilding scientists and practitioners. Welcome, Henny.
Hi all. Hi.
And last but certainly not least is Edwin Mallins, who is Nature Reserves Manager at the London Wildlife Trust, where he oversees 37 nature reserves across Greater London. Welcome, Edwin.
Hi, everyone.
It's great to have you all here. First, I think before we get into the details of it, I wonder how you each interpret or understand the term rewilding. Are there any common misconceptions around its use and definition, for example? Tilly, do you want to kick us off?
I think Henny should go first, actually.
Okay. Thanks, Tilly. And hi, everybody who I can't see at home. So I think my personal definition, having worked with rewilding, having thought about rewilding for a few years now, is essentially a process by which we increase the space and the opportunities for nature, by which I mean non-human species, to be autonomous, to express themselves, to live their lives in the way that they want to enter into different relationships with each other. And I think that often rewilding is misconstrued or is misunderstood or misrepresented as a particular tool to achieve that. So often you will hear people talk about reintroducing large predators as rewilding, and sometimes that's conflated in people's minds, so that people think rewilding is, the reintroduction of wolves and the reintroduction of lynx, but it's not. It's a tool to achieve increased autonomy of nature, and the same is to do with space. People often think, well, rewilding can only really happen in big spaces where you have enough opportunity for non-human species to do whatever they want to do. I don't think that's true. I think rewilding can occur in very small spaces, in urban spaces. And then the last one, that is probably the most controversial one, is that sometimes people think that rewilding means an absence of people, that nature is the opposite of humans, and that to successfully rewild a place, we need to remove people and their artifacts, and I don't agree with that. I think nature can be autonomous and people can be in the same space at the same time.
Yes, I agree completely, and I think she does a very good job of describing it. For me, it's also really the process of allowing nature to come into that space and creating the opportunity for species to be present in a way that we've traditionally kind of excluded them. humans developed a very clean aesthetic over time. And so if you imagine that kind of perfect lawn, we have to change that whole aesthetic and be much more relaxed about what we see in a grassy space. So it's the process of us accepting that and allowing that to happen so that species can, as Henny says, become more autonomous in that space. But in order to do that, we have to change our whole outlook on aesthetics and ecology and move in a direction that allows small spaces, medium spaces, large spaces to become much more natural and thus look after themselves much better. The more natural they are, the less of the burden of management. Not that management goes away.
I would agree with all that. I think the term has become slightly confused because it's often used by a variety of organisations to describe quite a wide variety of things because it sounds good. But I guess in its like classic definition, it's about allowing nature to be more self-willed rather than sort of a prescribed way of looking at an environment as defined by us humans who've become quite used to being the dominant force in the landscape. So I guess a good sort of example of projects like that are ones that are involving larger spaces and the use of tools like large herbivorous animals to shape the landscape rather than us with machinery. So that's a kind of classic definition, a classic kind of example of it. But yes, as the other panelists have said, it can apply to much smaller spaces and contexts as well.
So, I mean, a lot of you have sort of talked about what seems to be authenticity, sort of authentic nature, letting it be itself. And that seems to be something that's becoming more popular. Like when we think of the countryside or the wild, perhaps we are starting to think of more of these wild spaces. But do you think sometimes there is a risk that rewilding can say that we want to go back to some rose-tinted view of a particular past rather than actually doing what's best for, say, biodiversity, which is a very related topic?
Yes, the pastoral idyll is an interesting thing. We have these visions of what landscapes may once have been, but those are often, paintings that are giving a particular view on a landscape and may not be exactly what was there, but certainly allowing more species in, which may require management to get them there. It may require reintroductions. It may require creating the conditions for them to arrive, is messy, and that's wonderful. But we have to relearn how to perceive that.
I think there's also an important question around why we choose certain paths, because obviously we have a choice. We can go back 100 years or 1,000 years or 10,000 years. We could go back 10 million years. I mean, we can't, but sometimes we choose the past as a sort of shortcut for this is authentic. This is before like people made something bad, or this is before the bad thing happened. And if we can only go back to sort of the Garden Eden, then it will all be okay. And that's not really how the reality of it works, because the reality is that we have climate change. So, a species group that might have been very happy in a space 100, 200 years ago may not be happy in that space for much longer. So then we have to ask ourselves, is it really worth encouraging that species group back, or should we look around and see, what do places look like that have drier climates, or that have climates that are more similar to what we expect that place to have, and then maybe take some inspiration from that and accept that we can't go back to the past, and nature's ever evolving, literally, and we have to make the best of that.
I think the past is a means to understand how we got to where we are today, but it isn't necessarily something that we should be looking to pinpoint at some point in history and return to it, because, as Henny says, at which point do you choose? And often people's view of the past is kind of viewed through a slightly kind of rose-tinted lens, and like different based, like, so for example, in some species groups like butterflies, a lot of recording of butterflies started in the early 1970s. So when we look at a graph of how butterflies are doing, it tends to start in the early 1970s. But even that first point in the 1970s would have been considerably lower than if you took a point in the 1850s or the 1620s or whatever. So we're often kind of a little bit hamstrung by the data sets that we use to try and understand how things have changed over the past. I think what rewilding has done quite positively as a kind of concept over the last 10 to 20 years is I don't think, for me, that it's about trying to find some past state. It's about sort of allowing nature to find a kind of new balance for itself. Like, nature is quite resilient. Nature's good at changing and adapting. But if we kind of release our tight grip on it slightly and give it the space to maneuver a bit more, as Henny says, we're encountering a lot of challenges in this sort of century to come, particularly with climate change. But there are ways that we can allow nature to kind of find its own course a little bit more to respond, react to that.
So it sounds like what we want to achieve with rewilding is just to help nature thrive. There's a question that's come in that's quite interesting from AM in the YouTube feed that says, how are the impacts of rewilding or the introduction of a new species, how are these predicted or modeled or assessed? So, e.g., how do you look at the positive and negative changes to ecosystems' functions? Now, ecosystems are complicated. So I guess they're asking, how do you know that you're going to be doing good when you change something?
I guess you actually don't always know that. And that's partly why it's exciting, because if we're talking about things like beavers or reintroducing large herbivores as a kind of substitute for wild herbivores that would have lived in the landscape in the past, yes, you can have a fairly good idea about how they might behave, and you can control how many of them there are. And ultimately, a lot of those projects are operating within large fenced areas, and you're in charge of which areas are within the fence. But we are talking about non-human behavior, which we can't directly control. So modeling is probably only so good in that context. And I think that's why people, big proponents of rewilding, find the whole process exciting, because it isn't entirely predictable.
In an academic sense, there are several ways that we look at this. Yes, we look at how that species behaves where it is now. So if we're going to bring it back in here, we see how it interacts there. We see how analogous species, which kind of do the same thing and are the same size, behave here. So we have several sources of finding information that enable us to predict, but people don't go around sort of reintroducing things willy-nilly. There's a proper risk assessment process. There's a proper biosecurity process that accompanies this. It's not a free-for-all. Within the country, we can translocate things. So something that's doing particularly well in Kent might be moved to Sussex. But we don't move things internationally without a great deal of thought. Another thing to consider is that a lot of the rewilding headlines do involve the big things, the big furries and the predators. But actually, an awful lot of it, and really important foundations of it, are looking at the bottom. It's reintroducing formerly native plants. It's expanding the distribution of insects, which are particularly productive in woodlands, in turning over the soil. So it's very much more about encouraging the small things so that the biodiversity itself can grow. And maybe one day it will be suitable for bigger things. But we really, with rewilding, it's important in many contexts to start right at the bottom and build up.
Henny, did you want to add anything to that?
No, that's all I would have had to say as well.
I guess just one other thing that I'd like to add is a lot of scientific research sort of up till the present day has been in the prism of the landscape, particularly in the United Kingdom, where we have one of the most managed landscapes in the world, is looking at it through the prism of how we're currently managing it. So sometimes there are things we don't understand about species that in a context of a kind of rewilded landscape, they can surprise us. And at the Knepp estate in Sussex, which I imagine we will discuss more throughout this talk, but in short is an area of formerly agricultural lands, which has been a long-running rewilding project where they've used large herbivorous animals to transform the landscape. But that kind of taught us new things about how nightingales behave. They were thought to be a kind of coppiced woodland bird, but actually they do really well there in the kind of scrub that's billowing out into the formerly agricultural fields. So ornithologists learned kind of something a bit different about that bird, because it was kind of operating in this country in a context that maybe wasn't the ideal condition for it, but that was all that was left to it. So, you know, sometimes there are things that can surprise us that because we are managing the landscape so heavily, kind of up to the present day.
I mean, NEP has been an excellent experience for people to watch, because they didn't just suddenly say, this whole place is going to go wild. They released different fields over a time series. So we have this opportunity to see rewilding in action through their experience. And they've been extremely generous hosts over the years, and had several Imperial College students living out there for the summer, doing their studies and looking at, you know, how many worms are there in the soil in these recently released fields versus how many worms are there in the soil in these fields that have had pigs churning them up for some period of time. So we get a lot of information as their experience of rewilding. They've been, you know, instructive and very, very generous with their experience. But they are big scale, lots of little things too.
Well, I knew the NEP estate would come up sooner or later, and I think among people who know about rewilding, it's very famous. But I guess for most people, what we think of when we think of rewilding is perhaps beavers coming back to Devon or lynx coming back to Scotland. So what do you think of those kind of projects? Are they more than a PR exercise? Are they really useful? Or are there more examples like NEP that you would rather that people knew about?
I think examples like NEP illustrate more of the things that rewilding can do. And I think it's really important to talk about these reintroduction exercises, and they do capture the imagination. But then the risk is that we conflate that with rewilding when it's not. So at NEP, they're very clear that reintroducing or introducing large herbivores or beavers into the landscape is a part of it. It's because they need these animals to do certain things in the landscape, like graze and rummage through the soil and aerate and all of those things. The fact that there are beavers or large herbivores there in and of itself is less important than the activities that they do. And then the focus shifts to sort of how the entire landscape develops together. So then we have, I was involved in a study looking at how the vegetation changed across the NEP estate over the past 2 decades. And you see this incredible increase in shrubs all throughout the estate, but especially in those parts of the estate where they held back on the large herbivores and gave the land a little while to develop without being grazed. And that's incredible to see, and it's so exciting to see that you have, you know, tiny changes in initial condition can just spark all these different pathways. And so I think that's why examples like that are really cool when we talk about rewilding.
We're just looking here at a sign from the NEP estate, isn't it, that shows that some of their free grazing animals. So I think what they have, pigs, ponies.
They have deer. I actually also, I don't know if we're going to talk about that later, but the thing that fascinates me about this is because there's like such an inherent tension in that sign. It's a sign and a fence that keeps the people out, and it alerts you to the fact there's free roaming animals. And it's sort of weird, isn't it? We're trying to have a wild place there, and yet the way we go about this is with this very orderly sort of be aware of the animals, and here's the border, and here's the fence.
Well, I think we've become very unaccustomed to animals in many ways, and we're not used to bumping into wild animals in that way. Sorry, Ed. This is
actually a picture from one of our nature reserves in London, but it could also it's not an entirely dissimilar view to what you might see at the Nep estate. So just for those in the audience who kind of haven't thought about things in this way, that all domesticated animals that we have sort of under our wing, as it were, are descended from wild animals, and over time humans have, through selective breeding, got them to arrive where they are today. But what the Nep estate is doing is using kind of domestic animals as a kind of proxy for wild animals that are no longer with us. So in the case of cattle, such as this one, which is an English longhorn cow, they're descended from a wild animal called the aurochs, which is now extinct. And those animals would have lived in wild herds roaming across Europe, possibly in not an entirely dissimilar way to the way that large herbivorous animals behave in the African savanna today, in the sense that they wouldn't just sit in one spot all the time, which is kind of what we've done to them now. We just put them in a field and they stay there. Maybe we move them to another field if we fancy it. But, you know, they would have been following things like the rains, and they would have been following availability of food, and modifying their behavior in the presence of potential predators. So the concept of a project like Nep is to allow these domestic animals to, I guess, somewhere inside them find the wildness that their ancestors once have, and behave across a larger area as a kind of proxy for a wild animal. And there's a kind of a thing that is often maybe espoused by people, that the pre-human landscape of Western Europe would have been wall-to-wall tree canopy, and a squirrel could have jumped into a tree in John O'Groats and run all of the way to Land's End without touching the ground, which sort of rewilding, sort of the theory of that kind of blows that apart, because when you have large herbivorous animals, they are manipulating the vegetation of the landscape so that you've got a more mosaic effect, and the landscape is probably gradually shifting over time between different habitat types as we would classify them. But so it's just a kind of a way to sort of reimagine the landscape and kind of do away with some of the kind of idyllic fantasies that we might have about what it used to look like. And the Nep estate is a good example of how you can kind of use modern domestic livestock. They tend to use what would be known as heritage breeds of livestock that are not commonly used by modern agriculture, but have more traits in common with the wild animal that they're seeking to be a proxy for. So I thought I'd spell that up a little bit.
Can I just jump in there and just say that I guess it's important, or it's important to remember, I guess is what I want to say, is that the focus on large herbivores, that's a peculiarity of European rewilding. Our North American colleagues, they get much more excited about predators, and there's much more of a focus on reintroducing the large predators there. And then I guess if we want to zoom out globally, then it is also good to keep in mind that when we think about rewilding, we think about sort of Europe and North America, rather than landscapes in Africa or South America, where we often have more landscapes that have been less affected by past land use change than European North American landscapes. So it's not just, like the large herbivores are certainly a really valuable tool, but not the only way in which rewilding occurs.
So I'm really interested in rewilding in urban areas, in smaller spaces, and how we can get those spaces to be more diverse. But we've got a perception problem a lot of the time that they can't be terribly valuable. And just by working on those spaces where we can increase the floral diversity, we then start to get more insects. Insects have got this terrible PR problem in cities, where almost everybody thinks that they're scavengers and they're nasty. And when you see a lot of insects in the city, that most urban dwellers' response is probably to stomp on them, which is going to take a big change as we go. Yes, ants can be annoying, but they're doing really good jobs within the ecosystem. And they're really helping us to aerate the soil, and they clear away a lot of rubbish. But, our vernacular is ants in your pants at a picnic. So we've got a lot of work to do to make biodiversity and rewilding in urban areas very much more acceptable. We've had a lot on pollinators, and people are starting to really understand that actually having pollinators is very important in the urban environment. There's been a great growth in beekeeping in urban areas. And to support those insects that we like, we are going to have to work really hard on floral diversity in urban areas and make use of every little corner that we can.
Now, I do want to get on to what we can do as individuals, and especially in urban areas. But if we could just go back one bit, just before we move on, I want to talk about farming, because I know we've had a few questions about this. So, for example, Christina sent in a question before we started about how can we teach farmers the importance of rewilding so they don't feel threatened? And, is there a conflict with, say, sheep farming that's so widespread in the UK?
I guess the thing that sort of irks me around that debate is that there's this, it can often seem like the conservationists are coming and they teach the farmers how to use their land, when actually the farming community, certainly in the UK, often considers themselves as stewards of the land, and they don't really. Well, they don't really need. They know very well what's going on in their land, and they many of them have decades of experience and have gone to university, and so it's not really that there's a sort of like a knowledge gap. It's not like there's all this knowledge about how nature could thrive that academics are somehow hoarding. I think there's a disconnect in the cultures, and that often what we see is conservationists with very good intentions coming into a landscape and saying, hey, we can bring back the species, we can do this thing, and that would be really cool. And what that sounds like to farmers is not, hey, we have these opportunities, but what that sounds like is, we're going to take away control over your land. You're not doing the right thing. We will reduce your opportunities to earn your own livelihood. We will reduce the opportunities to carry out farming in the way that you want to, and then you have massive conflicts that actually lead to the abandoning of rewilding projects and often also restoration projects in the end. So I think it's more about making the space to have a good conversation and to really build long-lasting and trusting relationships between people, and then thinking together about, okay, what can we do?
I completely agree with that. And while we're still on the large scale, I know we're coming down to small scale in a second, but like you can't do large scale landscape change without the buy-in of local communities. That is like just deeply unethical to force that on people. So it has to be about conversation and sort of joint agreement about if any major changes are going to be taking place, rather than in sort of forcing it onto people.
Yes. We must never forget that farming happens in a particular way because of the funding structure surrounding farming. For generations, they've been paid for a specific productivity. Actually, now we're coming into a stage where that looks as though it's going to change, and that farmers are going to be paid in a different way. And we don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but that we're going to encourage the landscape to deliver these public goods, these things that we all benefit from, in addition to just it being food.
That kind of answers the question that I was about to ask, which is how do you, what are the benefits to local people and farmers? How do you explain these? And I guess that's one of them. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that before we move on?
Can I ask Tilly a question, actually? So I was really interested in thinking, because you already mentioned, we've made some progress with pollinators, and now there's a better public understanding that like pollinators are a good thing. What do you think are what are like good ways of like communicating the benefits of like the less charismatic species or the sort of more messy aspects of rewilding to people?
Well, I think we certainly have to start in the school curriculum, and we have to get kids muddy. And that's, it's a problem that we don't get our kids muddy. And it's very difficult for schools in so many ways to take kids out, especially urban kids. And most people are now urban. And that's a worldwide pattern. So it becomes very difficult for kids to get out and get muddy and get dirty. But they really benefit from that exposure. They benefit in all sorts of ways, in mental health ways, in physical ways, in educational ways. But we've got quite a lot of catching up to do with the parents as well. I mean, if you're a young parent and it's a bit addling and suddenly your kid's covered in mud, you may try to prevent that because it's so much work for you. So we need to help people understand at every step of the way. We need really good information in our public spaces. That as you come out of the car park or near the tube station, near a green space, that tells you about what you're going to see, so you understand it. So I think that it's communication, and education at every single step of the way, so that people understand what it is you're trying to achieve, and also why that may be better. Why it may be better to have this tussocky space with lots of different plants and animals in it than it is to have something that you can mow with a great big mower.
I mean, that really turns us to the urban landscapes then that most of us live in. So, for example, a question from Susan Scuthan here in the chat. So this is all good for large scale and big organizations, but what small things can individuals do? If we're engaged and we've read those poster boards about what other people are doing, what can we do?
Well, I guess it obviously depends what space is available to you, but there are lots of small things that can go on in the tiniest of urban green spaces. And even for people who don't have their own garden, there are potentially a local communal area that you might be able to influence what goes on there. So things like log piles, dead wood is something that was considered to be not aesthetically pleasing. And maybe by some people is still considered to be not aesthetically pleasing and needs to be tidied away. But nature had quite good ways of recycling dead and decaying wood. Otherwise, we'd be swamped with all of the trees that have died in the history of the world. So, there are lots of insects and fungi that need that to be there. Pollinating flowers for pollinating insects, wildflowers can be grown in quite tiny little spaces as well. So even in very small spaces, you can provide little pockets of habitat for the insects that Tilly's referring to, really, which are part of a wider food chain.
Tilly, do you want to pick it up from there? Are there particular flowers we can encourage?
Plant anything anywhere. Get those little bee-friendly packets of seeds and put them in cracks in the pavement. Plant anything anywhere. Every little helps. It really does. We're never going to have a continuous green space in the urban environment, but we can give patches for things to move between. And almost all the insects are pretty mobile, so they will move between patches. We tend to have a slightly unusual subset of insects in the urban environment. They tend to be the dispersers, the ones that move around very easily. And same for the vertebrates as well. We have rapidly dispersing creatures like foxes and pigeons and rats. They disperse very, very well. So into the urban areas, you get those things. And the greater the amount of little bits of green space we can give, and of diverse tree plantings, not just the same species all the time, the greater the diversity can be. And every tiny patch matters. Encouraging people to have green roofs, and not necessarily manicured green roofs, but almost just leaving a bit of rubble on a roof that allows natural colonization can produce the most wonderful effects.
Yeah, I know my parents rewilded a bit of their garden. They built a little wildlife pond that they just seeded natural species. And as soon as my dad had finished filling it up with a hosepipe, some kind of pond skater bug just dropped in. It just knew it was there. It knew there was a new home for it. So you really can encourage insects quite quickly, I think. There's one interesting question we've had come in through the YouTube from Madison E11, which is it possible to rewild derelict buildings or brownfield sites? Edwin, I don't know if you had any experience of that with any of the sites in London.
Well, funnily enough, they actually kind of to a large extent do it themselves. I think as a species, we've become quite fixated on us as the architect of the landscape. We're quite into planting trees, and I'm not knocking the concept of tree planting, but trees planted themselves for quite a long time before we thought about doing it. Through the process, which is called succession, where sort of early pioneer habitats lead through to more mature habitats, usually arriving at woodland if there's nothing kind of disturbing it on its way, whether that's us manipulating it or herbivorous animals. But let's assume there's none of those things on our brownfield site, then they will gradually reach the state of being what would be called a secondary woodland, so a woodland that's grown by itself naturally. Some brownfield sites can be particularly good places for insects, reptiles, particularly ones that are quite heavily covered in concrete, because they tend not to turn into woodland particularly fast because it's harder for the trees to take root. So you get usually a kind of very thin soil layer developing, and you get in such kind of poor soil conditions, that's often where the greatest diversity occurs, because the harder it is for things to grow, the less likely it is that dominant species will take over. So you can end up with actually very biodiverse brownfield sites, and I do find it slightly frustrating because it's a common thing for politicians to say, like, we need to build on the brownfield and protect the greenfield, but actually quite often things that appear to be nice and green might be quite biologically dead spaces because they've been sprayed for the last 60 years with a whole host of chemicals. Meanwhile, the local industrial estate that's been abandoned for 30 years might be a whole host of insects, plants, reptiles, birds living in there. So I think kind of you can't just come up with a blanket statement about whether, which areas are best and which areas are worst. The context is key. There's lots of nuance between them. But brownfield sites, can develop into quite amazing wildlife spaces of their own accord. But at the same time, you can give them a helping hand if you want to turn them into a particular space. So one of our kind of flagship nature reserves in central London, Camberley Street Natural Park, it's between King's Cross and St Pancras stations. That used to be a coal drop where trains would come in and drop coal to be taken away on barges, which is something that doesn't happen anymore. And that site was derelict since the 1960s. And in the 1980s, it was turned into a small nature reserve, which has been kind of a little oasis of green in quite an urbanised area ever since. So yes, that's a completely positive and possible thing. So just when you hear politicians knocking the brownfield sites, do have a think about whether actually they might be quite special places.
Yes, this is a picture here of a brownfield site very near where I live, that I'm slightly obsessed by this brownfield. So it's an abandoned site, and it's on clinker, so it's incredibly well drained and it's very nutrient poor. And because of that, no single species manages to dominate, and it's full of tiny little varied plant species. And in summer, it's absolutely full of wonderful insects. So long live brownfield sites, let them get on with it, and let's protect some of them from development and from aesthetic purities.
There's a great there's an abandoned steelworks in the west of Germany. They have lots of abandoned steelworks and coal mines and everything. That's been turned into what they call a landscape park. So you go in and you can go around the old abandoned steelworks, and you can go on tours and learn about all this like very heavy industrial work that went on there. And then you can go around the outside of the steelworks, where lots of plants have been able to just establish as they please, and it has like hundreds of plant species now, and it's a wonderful place to. I visited I think 2 years ago, and it's a wonderful, exciting place to be. I think one of the really exciting examples in this context, although slightly morbid, is Chernobyl, which has actually seen just an incredible return of nature, for obviously awful reasons, but that it's not a dead space, and nature will come back in the most surprising of places.
Well, Angkor Wat is an amazing example of that. You know, we all think of Angkor Wat as being terrifically ancient. It's actually not that old. It's just that the jungle came back in and took over. And they built those temples relatively rapidly, and they don't have foundations. So they're built on sand, so they fell down very quickly once the plants started to come in with those roots. So, you know, nature left to its own devices, nature will out.
Yeah, now, Edwin, you talked about that kind of nature coming back in succession, and we've got a question here from Russell Giblet that says, by allowing succession and rewilding without large herbivores to occur in an urban setting, would it not decrease flora diversity and therefore require us to introduce a level of human management? So can we ever leave these sites to be by themselves?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, again, sort of going back to what I said in answer to the previous question, sort of context is quite key. There are some habitats that are quite, well, they are human constructs, basically, but sort of by accident, they are quite biodiverse, and chalk grassland is quite a good example of that. It's a habitat that is sort of been created by grazing of chalk downland, and is incredibly floristically diverse. But if you want to reduce the kind of intense grazing pressure that's on it, the floristic diversity would go down, because more scrubby species would start to come in, and they would quite quickly overshadow the low-growing flowers that are supporting quite a large variety of insects, particularly butterflies. This is an aerial picture of Hutchinson's Bank, which is one of our nature reserves in the south of the borough of Croydon. On the left-hand side is the suburb of New Addington. It's a relatively big site as urban nature reserves go, but in the kind of context of landscapes, it's, you know, relatively contained. And we do quite a lot of active management on it in order to maintain its butterfly populations, particularly because it's a site well known for large populations of relatively rare butterflies like the small blue, which require quite specific management in order for their populations to remain stable. So I think, although rewilding, I think even some of the main proponents of rewilding as a concept would probably agree that where you have rare species sort of surviving in quite delicate habitats, it's probably not a great idea for those bits of land to be the ones that are first put through a kind of rewilding process. What rewilding, if we return to the Knepp Estate example, can do is take areas of land that weren't particularly biologically rich because they've been sort of heavily used for agriculture, and quite rapidly turn them into very biologically rich spaces. So I wouldn't really be advocating for meddling with sites that are already supporting quite a large number of rare species. I think there's plenty of other land across the country where you're starting from a lower baseline, essentially, so you can sort of build them up from there rather than tinkering with something that's already quite biologically rich.
And I guess rewilding doesn't have to be the answer to all our environmental problems, and it's just another tool in the toolbox. And in some sites it's going to be very appropriate, and in other sites it's going to be terribly inappropriate. Yeah.
So when we're managing an urban nature reserve, if we just, in a small urban nature reserve in a London borough, let's say, if we did absolutely nothing, they'd mostly be secondary woodlands. So but using kind of mechanical intervention, we can create a mosaic of little mini habitats throughout a site, which makes that site more biodiverse, and also more interesting to visit and learn about wildlife in an urban space. So it wouldn't be classed as rewilding, you know, but there's a lot of kind of direct human intervention on a site like that. But nonetheless, I think in those contexts, it's an appropriate way to continue to manage them.
So there is management and there is research that goes into rewilding. We got a question here from Angela Vaughan, who asks, how has the pandemic and the halting of business as usual impacted rewilding and your research?
I think that's changed in several ways. I think that in some of the urban areas, it's put an enormous amount of pressure on our green spaces. So spaces that were starting to move in a wild direction. and were being managed explicitly for that, not necessarily to get to the full climax community of giant herbivores in there, but in a wilder and more natural direction, have suddenly been hit by human pressure. And it's not just humans. There's been an enormous number of people who've got dogs in the pandemic. So urban dogs and poorly controlled urban dogs have become quite a problem. And they're a problem they're a problem from Hyde Park to Wormwood Scrubs. So we're managing an extra pressure on the areas that we're moving in a wild direction. We're managing an extra footfall. We're managing some more naive dog owners. So there's lots of extra pressures that come in there. But at the same time, it's also interrupted a lot of funding. Funding has gone very specifically towards COVID in recent times, and that's entirely justifiable. We needed to know a lot about it very quickly. But it's taken funding away from some of the more natural projects. There's been a halt in some fundings, and that we hope will come back. So business as usual, certainly in urban areas, has led to more people coming into the green spaces. But it may be different in countryside areas. I don't know that much about what's been happening in countryside nature reserves, although I suspect it's different, and they maybe have been released from a human pressure. The intensity of human pressure in cities has had a big impact on progression towards rewilding. And certainly with lots of naive dogs around, no one's going to be grazing the urban areas without a lot of security on them.
But on the positive side of that, I think there's a lot of people since the start of the pandemic who have discovered the green spaces on their doorstep because they were forced to. It's almost government mandate. You've got to go and exercise in your local area. And particularly for where we're managing nature reserves in suburbia, they're often our less frequented sites, because quite typically people in those areas, if they fancy going for a walk in pre-COVID times, would have just jumped in the car and driven out to Kent or driven into Essex or whatever. And now they were like, oh, let me actually see what's in my local area. So we had quite a lot of people saying, oh, this site's great. I never knew it was there. So yes, we've had more people, and that brings challenges with it. But I think that's a good thing when people are able to kind of discover what's on their doorstep when previously they weren't there.
Yeah, that is a very good point. Had we known it was coming, we'd have put useful information, useful, accessible information and better signage in many places before vastly more people arrive.
And I think if those people decide to continue visiting these sites, then we've got to be having a conversation about having more accessible green space and wild space in cities, because we shouldn't be saying to those people, oh, you shouldn't come here anymore. We should be saying, right, where's next, to try and satisfy the demand that's now being created.
Yeah, I was going to say, so there is a sort of tension between more people discovering these spaces, but then more people perhaps impacting those spaces. So what would you like people to do who've now gained a new appreciation for their spaces? Is it then taking it into their own gardens or balconies or whatever it is, or supporting your projects? What would you like to see people do?
I'd like to see the general public use it thoughtfully and learn about it, understand it, begin to think, why are they doing things this way, and ask the questions and join the conversation with the managers and learn to really love these places, because we intuitively love them. But actually there's lots of management challenges to keep them the way that you want them to be. And people like Edwin are doing an amazing job of keeping a diverse and mosaic landscape available to us. So I would say certainly we want to get people engaged, and we want people to understand. Write to your MP, tell him you want more, him or her, that you want more green space, that you want to support green, because it is so good for us in so many different ways. And we need sports pitches for people to run around and exercise on, but we also need woodlands and meadows and spaces where people can get an appreciation of what wildness is for us, as well as for the wildness itself.
Yeah, I think connecting to the local spaces is really important. There's probably local Facebook groups. I know at my local group, park, there's a local birding group. There's a local group of people who are engaged in collecting rubbish. So try and find people who also like whatever patch of green you like and see what they're doing. Maybe there's local charities or local NGOs who do allotment gardening, or who organize sort of public flower beds. If you want to get engaged and spend some of your time actively working in the wild spaces around yourself, I think that's a brilliant plan. And getting to know your neighbors and the people around you that also use the spaces, I think is a really important aspect of the rewilding process.
I think there's one thing about nature in urban areas that is often overlooked. Nature in urban areas is under a lot of different pressures compared to nature in the countryside. There's particularly things like light pollution, heavy disruption to the way they might behave in terms of like how fragmented the landscape is, noise pollution, etc., air pollution, lots of things that make being a wild organism more challenging. However, one thing that they're not generally under so much pressure from is the kind of industrial use of chemicals that has been going on in the countryside for the last 60 years. Again, going back to a point I made earlier, that sometimes things look green, but they aren't always green. So a beautifully arranged crop of wheat might look great out of the train window, but if it's been sprayed quite significantly with insecticides, probably not much living around it. But a quite scruffy little urban park might actually have quite a lot going on in it, even if it looks a bit untidy. So that's the kind of advantage that urban areas have. And I think it's just great that people can access stuff on their doorstep, because that's where people sort of learn about it most. Wildlife shouldn't be something that exists as like an other thing, that wildlife in the countryside, it's not around here. It should be something that everyone can access and enjoy, learn about, and increase their sort of passion and understanding of.
So part of the signage should probably be, here's where you're going to find the local birder group. Here's where you're going to find, someone who will walk you round and tell you about the ecology of this space. Every second Friday at 7 p.m, or whatever it is, to communicate how to find the ways to understand the area.
Yeah, I think having somebody who's familiar with the site and familiar with species, having somebody who's familiar with insects take you around a woodland is a completely different experience from certainly myself, who knows nothing about insects. Apologies, Tilly. And just going, oh, that's a nice fuzzy thing.
Well, that's a nice fuzzy thing is better than eee!
Yeah.
We're nearly out of time, but we've got time for a couple more questions. So there's one that's coming from Lara that says, are temporary wild planting schemes in urban areas beneficial or potentially damaging?
My feeling is that they aren't always meant to be temporary. They're just not very well designed, and they end up being temporary. So if you're ever in a position to comment or influence in some way a scheme that someone or some organisation is doing to introduce wildflowers, say, do get them to have a think about what mix of species they're planting, because there's this thing that is quite commonly used called pictorial meadow mix, which is a kind of mixture of flowers that are largely not European in origin, quite a lot of North American species that look great for about a year, and then they start to look really patchy and bare, and then after about a year or two, whoever the land manager is thinks that looks terrible, I'm getting rid of that. So that's possibly why they appear to be temporary. I don't think they are meant to be quite often. They're just badly planned because someone was browsing through a seed catalogue and liked the look of the pictorial meadow mix, which might be providing something useful for pollinating insects. But in many insect life cycles, the pollinating part of their life is just a part of their life. They actually have, if we take butterflies as a pollinating insect, they might go and visit a flower, but their caterpillars usually are feeding on the specific species of plant or suite of species, and the pictorial meadow mix does absolutely nothing for them. So I think when done properly, wildflower areas can be a great thing, but just sometimes people are prioritizing the aesthetics over the kind of ecological integrity, and then it comes back to bite them within a year or two when it starts to look not the way they originally envisioned it, and it's not been doing that much for wildlife throughout.
We've got another question here that I love that I hope one of you can answer. It's a question from Elena R. Kelly that says, lack of toilets generally, and more specifically in the pandemic, means people are using behind the bushes, etc. Do you think green toilets should be part of the rewilding narrative?
And why not? And why not? But you're right. There's certainly more antisocial behaviour in the way, because people are spending longer out in green spaces. There may be fewer facilities for the increase in pressure that there has been. And that's something we have to think about. So, maybe having a latrine pit in some places could be useful, or a composting toilet. But actually those things do need to be managed really quite actively to keep them good.
Excellent. Well, there's one question that we had in before we started that I really wanted to make sure I got in, maybe as the last question here, from Theo, that says, you are king or queen of the UK for a day. What one thing would you do to restore ecosystems and biodiversity in the UK?
One day? Can I have like a century? Can I have my own dynasty?
Maybe that day you can put in a policy that nobody can change. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh
God.
I think I would move everybody into cities and free the countryside and have lots of fantastic modern tech industrial farming that would allow us to release a lot of the countryside to become much more natural. So I think that we shouldn't be flying salads around the world. We should be growing them in tube tunnels.
I think I would make sure that after my tenure was over, the pattern of land ownership would look very different. I would make sure that a lot more land was owned by a lot more people, so that people have decision-making agency over their land, not just up in Scotland, but everywhere, to democratize the process, even as a monarch.
One thing I would do, but I'm not actually going to choose this because it's actually happening anyway, is to switch the focus from environmental subsidy payments away from kind of producing food towards producing public goods. And Tilly's already mentioned that, and that is kind of something that is actually in train already. So I don't think I would use that as my power. What I would use is to persuade people that to treat and respect the sea in the same way that we've come to sort of treat, respect and love the land. I think a lot of stuff goes on at sea that because we can't see it, we just turn a blind eye to it. If a farmer rounded up their cattle using a trawl net, people would probably have something to say about it. Just dragging a helicopter with a huge net across their land when they want to bring the cows in. But that kind of stuff goes on at sea all the time and no one says anything really. So, yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, we haven't really talked about the possibility of rewilding the oceans, but I suppose some people do talk about that. But I think that may have to be a topic for another evening because I think we are nearly out of time here. So all it remains for me to do is to thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you, Edwin, Tilly, and Henny for joining us in this incredibly interesting discussion. And thank you for everyone who joined us and asked very interesting questions on this event. If you have enjoyed tonight's event, do check out the rest of the Imperial Lakes programme. A link will be posted in the chat for you to explore what else is to come in this season. For those of you watching on YouTube, like I said, there were a lot of very interesting questions, but apologies if we weren't able to get to them. If you want to share this with your friends or watch a specific bit of again for more research, then a recording will appear soon on the Imperial College London YouTube channel. A link will also soon be posted in the chat to an evaluation form where you can just tell us what you thought of this event. So if you could take a couple of minutes to fill that in, that's really useful for us for planning more of these events. So thank you again to the panel and thank you for tuning in and providing interesting discussions. And that is it from me for this evening. Have a good evening, everyone.